the previous video, we explained why it is so difficult to arrive at a definition of terrorism. And in this video, we're going to explore the need for a definition, and also we're going to look into attempts to arrive at a generally accepted definition of the term. So we know it's very difficult to arrive at a generally accepted definition. But still, I think we should try. Why? Why is it so important to have a definition? Well, here are a number of reasons. We need a definition if we want to arrive at successful international cooperation in the fight against terrorism. Terrorism is a cross-border phenomenon, and that means that we have to be able to share data, and that means that we have to have some level of agreement. Who are we fighting? What constitutes a terrorist group or not? We already mentioned the problem of the listing of certain groups on a list of designated terrorist organizations. It would be nice if we agree on what group should be on that list or not. That would allow, for instance, the sharing of data or the extradition of suspects. It's very difficult if country A says this is not a terrorist group and the other one wants a certain person to be extradited and persecuted in another country. So a higher level of agreement on the definition would improve international cooperation. Also, from a legal perspective, there's another reason why we need some agreement on what is terrorism and what not, and to have quite precise definitions of terrorism. And that is what many human rights organizations call the risk of abuse. A lack of a definition or proper one is what they call an invitation to abuse. They say that in countries with no legal definition, or rather vague ones, it might be very tempting for governments, especially for governments of a more authoritarian nature, to use the label terrorism to silence all kinds of opposition, using terrorism charges to arrest or convict people, protesters, radicals, who have no intentions to use political violence. And the human rights organization Human Rights Watch, for instance, repeatedly expressed concern of the tendency of some governments to regard terrorism a wide range of conduct far beyond what is generally understood by that term, and to define terrorism in law using very broad and open-ended languages. So there are sometimes definitions of terrorism, but they're so vague that it's very difficult to label somebody a terrorist, a radical, or let's say a democratic protester. Countries make use of that or misuse of that, and a good definition can help to avoid that. There's also a need for a proper or generally accepted definition of terrorism among researchers. We are very often confronted with different definitions and try to make sense or give a general picture about developments with regard to terrorism, trends in terrorism. And I gave you the example of the number of casualties in recent years. I showed you data of the United States State Department, but I also used Europol, for instance, as a source, and the Global Terrorism Database. Well, each of them have a slightly different definition of terrorism, and I added them up to give you a general picture. I think it's okay for a general picture, but what if I add that, and I would like to make a proper analysis of trends in terrorism and add more of these data with different sources? How solid are my statements? I think they're problematic, to say the least. The challenge a lack of definition poses to international cooperation was one of the reasons why Kofi Annans, then Secretary General of the United Nations, actually from 1997 to 2006, tried to achieve a consensus about what is terrorism and what not. Well, let's see how he tried, and in the end, unfortunately, how he also failed. He tried to reach consensus about a definition that focused on the targeting and deliberate killing of civilians and non-combatants for political purposes. But this definition did not gain the support of all member states, although you might say, well, you know, what's harmful about a definition that focuses on killing of civilians and non-combatants? Who can be against that? nonetheless, it was difficult. And then also in a report titled Uniting Against Terrorism, Recommendations for a Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, you find a copy on the course dashboard, he tried with that document to send out the moral message that terrorism is unacceptable and unjustifiable. Again, that sounds pretty decent to say, but not all states saw this as a sound basis for moving forward. Why not? Some revived the ideas about foreign occupation and state terrorism that in their eyes justified violence that they didn't want to regard as or being labeled as terrorism. And also think back at Second World War or a number of countries that face an illegal occupation. It makes sense that people have that in mind, might be very much against something that is called unacceptable and unjustifiable under all conditions. So a number of states were against that. And in the end, the attempt also failed because some states did not want to hear anything about a suggestion or a definition that did not explicitly exclude state terrorism, meaning the idea that states could be labeled as terrorists if they use terrorist tactics against other governments or their population or against their own population. So he courageously tried, but unfortunately he failed. What about state terrorism? What do you think? Well, I guess I'm going to disappoint a few of you because personally I'm not so much in favor of labeling the violence by state authorities against other countries or the population of other countries or their own citizens as terrorism. We have international law, humanitarian law and the law of war. And I'd rather label the use and misuse of violence by states as war crimes or abuse of power and do not like to call that terrorism. We have a lot of legal instruments, international instruments that we can use to fight war crimes, abuse of power. But there are no such legal instruments in the field of terrorism. That's why I think we should be very careful to use the term state terrorism, and I prefer not to use it. That means that in this course, when we talk about terrorism, we talk explicitly about the use of political violence by non-state actors. Again, I do understand that many of you disagree, but I hope we can agree to disagree. Let us now move on to academic attempts to arrive at a definition. Well, the most often quoted attempt is that of Berto Jongman and Alex Schmid. In the 1980s, they sent out a questionnaire to leading scholars in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies. And they asked them, write down your definition of terrorism. And when these questionnaires came back, they studied them and tried to find key components that many people seem to agree upon. And they arrived at 22 key components. And in 2011, Alex Schmid updated this version. Again, he sent out a questionnaire and looked into the literature regarding the definition of terrorism. Have a close look at it and take your time. These are 12 core components and I would like to ask you a few questions about it. Which one do you think are more important? Which ones are less important? Maybe I should explain a few of them, but again, have a look at it yourself. For instance, the first one. It says that a core component of a definition of terrorism is that a definition should say something about the fact that terrorism is both a doctrine and a practice. So it's both an idea, a doctrine, and a practice, something that happens on the ground. It should also refer to the context in which terrorism is employed as a tactic. Think of, is it a war situation or not a war situation? These kind of contexts, according to Alex Schmid and others, is an important key component of terrorism. And then it also says that it should say something about the perpetrators, those behind terrorist attacks. Do you agree on that? Do you think that is a core component? Is it number 1 on your list or one of the last on your list? These kind of things I would like to know. But do you agree that a definition of terrorism should mention that terrorist acts form part of a campaign of violence? So not only one terrorist incident, but a series of attacks. Do you think that's an important component or not? That's what I want to know from you. In the questionnaire, we're going to ask you, what are the most important core components? Which 3 of them do you think should be in any definition of terrorism? So again, have a close look at these 12 components and pick your 3 most important ones. I'm very much interested in your opinion about core elements in a definition of terrorism. And I also have a message for you from Alex Schmidt, who is the author of the academic consensus definition that consists of these 12 parts.
So you have seen that it can be quite difficult to arrive at a satisfactory definition of the concept of terrorism. It's a contested concept like others. For instance, imperialism is a contested concept. Nevertheless, it is absolutely necessary that we talk about the same object rather than use vague and broad terms. However, in each country the usage differs a little bit, and since you come from many countries, we would be very much interested how the term terrorism is used in your country. Is it broadly applied, narrowly applied, loosely applied, or confined to certain groups only? So your collaboration in this would be very much appreciated.
Thank you for filling out the questionnaire. What did we learn this video? We looked into the need for a definition and also focused on 2 attempts. One by Kofi Annans, then Secretary General of the United Nations, and we looked at the academic consensus definition by Alex Schmidt. In the next video, we're going to focus on the essence of terrorism.